When I was in college, I chose to spend my summers working at a Bible camp called Metagoshi. It was in the middle of North Dakota. See, I had attended some different camps when I was a kid. I went several times, and I knew I wanted to experience being a counselor when I was old enough. And recently, my mom, she gave me a letter that she had received that I'd sent her. I'd written it back home to my whole family that first summer that I was on staff. And it was indeed a handwritten letter on college-ruled paper from a notebook. It felt archaic. And I have no memory of writing this particular letter, so it was both fun and a little surreal when I dove in to read it. When I opened this letter, I laughed because I wrote things like this. Here is a check to cover the cost of the long-distance phone call I made to my boyfriend. Remember, this was before cell phones were even around with unlimited minutes of call time. And I was endeared as I read it to the note where at the end I told my parents and my sister that I was excited for them to come visit me and to see this camp because they had never been there before. I hadn't been there either before I started working there. Because remember, this was before things like social media or FaceTime, where it was easy to share photos or see things in real time. But I was especially struck by how much I talked about still getting to know people. My letter, it mentioned my nervousness when it came to remembering names. I was figuring out who had worked there in previous summers and what college they had attended, if any. I figured out who grew up going to this camp. I was realizing things like my passion for music fit in well at this camp because we had a choir and a musical that helped share the story of Jesus. And I was figuring out how my talents and the talents of others would be utilized this summer. In this letter, I was trying to articulate something that now I have long come to appreciate from my 5 summers as a staff person there. Each summer staff was a very unique community of people who were so different from one another. A group of people who would have never chosen to be together were it not for our collective goal of loving kids, loving Jesus, and choosing to be at this Bible camp that was dedicated to sharing that love. Now, maybe some of you who are watching today, you could maybe relate to this. Maybe you've had a camp experience or some other type of group experience where you look at the person sitting across from you and you realize, I would never choose to be with you, and you probably never would choose to be with me. And yet here we are together, and now we have to figure out not only how to survive, but how to thrive. In chapter 14 of Romans, Paul is diving into his comments surrounding community life. He's talked throughout this whole book about the community of Gentiles and about the community of Jews, people who had nothing in common previously except now for their curiosity and their excitement about Jesus. And in the first part of chapter 14 that we talked about yesterday, Paul, he reminds us that any community needs to be careful about arguing for the sake of arguing. It's not helpful to anyone, let alone to the community. And for today's section, he starts pretty boldly in verse 13. Therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. See, I think Paul acknowledges that any community will be filled with diverse people who have diverse opinions. In fact, any community should have this type of diversity. But living in our separateness, that's not enough. Living parallel lives, well, it won't really work. Instead, in verse 19, he says this, let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. Another translation says mutual upbringing. How can our community build one another up? How can you and I, with our varying thoughts, our passions, and our varying ways of doing things, how can we provide support for one another? For me, being a part of that camp staff, it taught me this so well. We were all so different, but when we were brought together under the same mission centered on Jesus, we were able to do some really amazing things. And I'd suggest we all became better people for it. So today, as you finish up chapter 14, ask yourself, or maybe your partner, if you're reading Romans together, you might want to talk about these things together. Number 1, how can Christians with differing views be a part of the same church? And number 2, What can you do to build each other up and to build up the church? Hey, thank you so much for being with us today. We can't wait to see you tomorrow. We're getting close to the end of the book of Romans. We'll see you later.